How's that? Okay? Is that a thumbs up? Good evening to everyone. What an amazing number of people to come out on what is basically the best day of the year so far. So that's very good, but quite understandable because it's a very, very intriguing topic tonight. As you know, the Metaverse. So John O'Sullivan is in Rossniger, and we always try and get Rossniger speakers, so that's fantastic. And graduated in mechanical engineering, went to KPMG in a very different direction, I guess, and then was working with Amy. Was it Rosestone then, or Amy?
No, I was after Rosestone.
After Rosestone, so Amy PLC. I saw one of their vehicles in the village this morning, so not related to you. And you're going to tell us about the Metaverse, which is all about the digital world, and I think I better, after that, leave it to you to explain what it is and why it matters. So, the Metaverse.
Well, thank you very much, Owen. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So, talking about a slight technical issue.
It's all about the digital technology taking over the world. I don't even need to be too worried.
Oh, there we go. So talking about the Metaverse, very much a current issue. First of all, if you don't mind, I'd like to take you back to 1973. Now, looking at you all, I can see you're all too young to remember 1973. But it was quite a momentous year. So it was the year we joined the common market. Sadly, things have changed. Edward Heath was the Prime Minister. Leonid Brezhnev was the president of the then USSR, and you can see him there meeting Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon, who had just been re-elected, a re-election of Richard Nixon, interesting. Of course, that then did lead to the Watergate affair, and he resigned the following year. The picture of the car with a beautiful 1970s colour, that's the Ford Cortina Mark II, mind you. That was the most popular car that year. The USA did finally leave Vietnam, and The Godfather won Best Picture at the Oscars. I did include a little Liverpool picture there, so Liverpool was still the best team in the UK. But the one thing I suppose I wanted to talk about 1973 for, because it is 50 years, there was a young man who was walking along 6th Avenue in New York on the 3rd of April, and he lifted a brick to his ear and made the first ever mobile phone call. He worked for a company called Motorola, and a bit sadly, I think, the first mobile phone call was to his rival, a fellow called Joe Engel, who worked at AT&T's Bell Laboratories, basically saying, Yahoo sucks, we've done it first. But this was, at least arguably, the start of our technological revolution. And it is changing our society, and I think potentially in a way that could exceed the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And I hope to explore that a little bit more with you today. Just a question, how many of you managed to look at the YouTube link that Mark circulated? So a few. Well, if you get a chance, I would suggest that you do it. It's worth 10 minutes of your time. Alan Watts is the narrator of that YouTube clip, albeit it is contemporary images. But Alan Watts died in 1973. So what he's talking about is completely after his death. So he foresees something which is really quite impressive, I think. So the 70s saw quite a lot happening in the area of technology, which ultimately leads up to the Metaverse. So I'll just sort of fairly swiftly run through that, if that's okay. Obviously, Microsoft was formed in 75 by Bill Gates and Paul Allen, and Steve Jobs and others formed Apple shortly after in 1976. Initially in his parents' house in his bedroom. They graduated to the garage after that. Now, whilst the first mobile phone call happened in 1973, because there wasn't the infrastructure to support that as a common means of communication, it wasn't until the late 70s that that became a more common form of communicating. In fact, the first cellular network wasn't until 1979 in Japan. And in fact, in the US, it wasn't until the early 80s that the mobile phone became more generally available. And you can see there, I hope, an advert for the Motorola commercially available device. Now just bear in mind that this was sort of in the early 80s, and it was $3,995. And compare that with the current device. So you could only actually use it for about 30 minutes, and thereafter it would take 10 hours to recharge the battery. And in current day prices, that will be at least $15,000. And yet, how many of us have mobile phones now? Going on later into the 80s, then the World Wide Web was of course invented by Sir Tim Berners-Lee whilst he was at CERN, although that didn't really roll out to the general population until 1993, when it was available free of charge. By 2000, over 50% of all global telecommunications was through the World Wide Web. By 2007, that was 97%. So you can imagine the impact that has had. In 1998, Google was formed, and I'll talk a little bit more about Google in a while. Then the early noughties was really the launch of social media, with Facebook and Twitter making their faces felt. But as miniaturization and performance of technology improved, we started to see some really usable devices coming onto the market. I'm an Apple guy, so I'd talk about the first Apple iPhone was in 2007, and that had a touch screen, which was sort of fairly new technology. They do tend to lead the way, albeit that they are sort of tend to be expensive. And that extended to the Apple Watch in 2014. But 2017, Google Lens was developed, and whilst that hasn't really taken off, there's quite a lot of new technology that's following on from some of the examples that led. Now, 2021, I realise I'll be able to do this quite quickly because there's quite a lot more I want to talk about. Worldwide mobile phone users reached 7 billion. So current estimates are around about 8.1 billion people on the world today. So we are beginning to reach the point where everybody has access to a mobile phone. And then 2022, Elon Musk bought Twitter, and more of Elon shortly. So, the Metaverse. It's a fairly new term, but as society is increasingly driven by technology, it has become known, by some at least, as the Metaverse. It's a term created out of science fiction, and it combines the words universe with the Greek word meta, which means beyond or above, so it gives a sense of beyond reality. And of course it's become sort of ingrained in modern culture since Facebook renamed itself Meta Platforms, and Mark Zuckerberg committed to developing the Metaverse. So the technology that are particularly underlying the Metaverse are really virtual reality and augmented reality, and we'll explore those a little bit more shortly. But I also wanted to talk on humanity, because I said, is technology blurring humanity? When I originally started to talk to Bobby about potentially doing this talk, he said, well, what do you mean by humanity? Oh, I don't know. So I thought I'd better include a definition. And there are sort of three broad meanings. Obviously people in general, but perhaps most importantly, understanding and kindness between each other. And for me that's, I suppose, what I was meaning by humanity. But also, it means the condition of being human. And I would suggest to you, and we'll explore it a little bit more later, that technology actually has the potential to impact all three of those senses of humanity. So a bit more about virtual reality. I guess we're all familiar with what that means, but it's the ability to view an entirely virtual world, so it's imaginary, through a headset or head-mounted display. It primarily utilises sight, but also sound. In theory, you could use it from other senses, but that is currently where it's focused on. It's an increasingly widespread tool that is now going beyond its initial focus, which was in the gaming world. You might have seen a BBC Wales programme earlier in the year called A Special School about Ysgol Dairy in Penarth in South Wales. A young man who is quadriplegic was able to experience walking with the aid of a VR headset and a walking simulation machine, which he'd never been able to experience before. So it has some very real medical applications. Others include treatment of PTSD, some phobias and anxiety. And it enables patients to experience a situation that they have a problem with in a totally safe and controlled environment. So that enables them to become accustomed to whatever it is they're becoming afraid of. Earlier this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, there was a paper presented on the 5 innovations that are revolutionising healthcare, and one of those 5 was virtual reality. Just for completeness, because I think it's interesting, another one was artificial intelligence. I will talk about that later. 3D printing, that's used in the prosthetics arena and also for tissue replacement. So they can use 3D printing to, if you lose your ear, you can actually produce a new ear with tissue replacement 3D printing. Smart bandages was the other area. So Stanford University in California are working on bandages that can actively respond to changes in a wound to make sure that you're getting the best possible environment for the wound to heal. And the last one was a little bit beyond me. So effectively, it's genome editing. It's working at a cellular level to treat certain conditions. So certainly sickle cell anemia is one of the areas that might be able to help with. I did read a bit more about it, but didn't really understand it. Augmented reality, on the other hand, is where you see the real world, but it is improved or adjusted in some way through technology to help with what we experience. This obviously has a potential role in the entertainment arena, and some people will be aware of Pokemon Go, that was fairly familiar a few years ago. And many people will have an app on their phone that will tell them what they're looking at in the night sky. So effectively that is an augmentation to reality. Indeed, in my last role in Amy, one of the things we were looking at, and one of the biggest risks that we experienced was when digging in a roadway, you hit a cable unexpectedly. So we were working with Google Lens to try and facilitate a way of seeing the cable below the road. And whilst in theory you still have drawings that should give you that information, if somebody who's actually working in the road can sort of see the cable, it makes it less likely that they'll hit it by accident. So we can see that the Metaverse is increasingly impacting our world, and it's changing how we see things. I just wanted to pause briefly to touch on that reality, because it is becoming increasingly critical in how technology interfaces with all of us. So obviously we understand reality by what we receive through our senses. So if you talk about sight in this example, but effectively it's the same for all the senses. You receive light into your eye and it hits the cells, the cones and the rods at the back of the retina. This creates electrical impulses that creates pattern changes in the retina, and this is then fed through the optic nerve into the brain. And nerve impulses through the optic nerve create very complex patterns for electrical and chemical activity in the brain. But I suppose consciousness goes a little bit beyond that. So you've got a little picture on the back of your retina, but what you perceive and are conscious of is something that is very different to that. And part of that is through learned experience. But I don't see a flat picture. I see a three-dimensional real world that my brain is interpreting from a two-dimensional image. And how that interfaces with technology is becoming increasingly critical. However, it's not as simple as that even. So I just wanted to give us something to think about. So we look at these 4 examples here, and people will see different things. People will perceive different things. Their reality will be different. So for the same external impulses, people's reality is actually different. So for example, the top right picture is the man standing at the top of the structure or the bottom of the structure. Different people see it in different ways. The picture at the bottom right, do you see 2 trees or do you see a young lady? And the top left picture, most people will be familiar with the Ishihara colour blindness test. You know, most people will see a 12, but many people won't see a 12. In fact, 7% of all people have some level of colour perception problem. And then even beyond that, the bottom left picture is a depiction of synesthesia. That is, some people perceive, in this case, music as colour. So you don't listen to music, you see colour. Well, what it is your ears transmit a signal to your brain, but your brain interprets it as colour. And there are over 80 examples of synesthesia. So again, this is a complication of how we perceive things in reality. So I want to move on a little bit to 2023. And it's been quite an interesting year. You may have seen in the news in May, the University of Lausanne has implanted a brain-computer interface into a Dutchman called Gert-Jan Oskam. And he was a cyclist who became paraplegic after an accident. And what they've been able to do with the use of artificial intelligence is to effectively read the signals in his brain that are telling his legs to walk. They then interpret that through an AI interface that then wirelessly sends messages to an implant in his spine that then triggers the muscles in his legs. And so he is relearning to walk again with the use of a brain-computer interface. However, on a slightly cautionary note, which I wanted to mention, the US Surgeon General issued a report covering the impact of isolation on health and well-being. And I don't know if you can see it, but this chart is from that report. And so it says that lacking social connection is actually more dangerous to your life expectancy than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's also more dangerous than drinking 6 alcoholic drinks a day. So I'm okay. Now, the cause and effect is actually not clear. So he's basically saying we need to understand much better what is going on there. But a quote from the report says, "The existing evidence illustrates that we have reason to be concerned about the impact of some kinds of technology on our relationships, our degree of social connection, and our health." So it's not all good news, and that's, I suppose, part of the things that we need to consider. In July, you'll be aware that Threads was launched by Meta, the Metaverse company, to compete with Twitter. and Mr. Musk changed Twitter to rebrand as X. But also announced, which I think is potentially a really significant launch, is the Apple Vision Pro, which is, and you can see a picture of it here. So it's a bit like a ski goggle. It has cameras and microphones and speakers, and effectively you can see the world. In fact, it's through a camera, so what you're seeing is a picture, but effectively you can see the world and what's going on, and you can wear it all the time. But also you can use it to watch a movie. So if you wanted to, you could blank out the screen and watch a movie. You can also change the size of the movie, so you could watch it up here whilst walking around the street, or using your hands, you just open it up and you can make it, interestingly, in the literature they call it 100 feet wide to the screen. So you can make it so it completely takes over your being. You could also take 3D pictures. So you can take a picture and then replay it, and you can actually, so if it's of your child playing, you can actually walk around it, and you can recreate that experience at a later date. The slightly interesting thing is two things, I think, which I find slightly concerning. So, because you've got these goggles on, they're a bit concerned that people will be turned off by the impression when they see it. So, you will be able to see people's eyes, but it's not their actual eyes, it's a picture of their eyes. And when you go on FaceTime, again, because you have this headset on, what people will see is not you, it is an avatar of you. So you'll take a three-dimensional image of yourself, and the picture that people will see of you on FaceTime will be an animatronic avatar that represents what it thinks you are. So again, I think that's interesting. So, talking a little bit more about brain-computer interfaces, which I think is quite an interesting area of the metaverse. It's a very much developing area, as we saw with that example from Lausanne University. And indeed, this morning on the BBC News, there was a lady in Stanford who had lost the ability to speak through disease, but they are, again, through a brain-computer interface, and this is actually inserted into your brain. She's able to speak again via a brain-computer interface linked with artificial intelligence, and that currently it's being used to produce words on a screen. But it won't be long, and that will effectively be able to be a verbalised conversation. It's relatively slow, and there's still a relatively high error rate for that. And I suppose certainly neural interfaces is not that new, so you could argue that pacemakers are a form of neural interface, cochlear implants are a form of neural interface. But to get actually into the brain is relatively new technology. And our friend Mr. Musk formed a company called Neuralink in 2016, and they've been developing brain-computer interfaces, so far testing them primarily on animals. And indeed, there is a clip available of a macaque playing Pong, which is one of the very basic computer games, without any external control, so purely through thinking where it wants the paddle to go. And the good news is, 2023, May, the FDA gave Neuralink their approval for the first human trials. And I think that was in part prompted by the success that Lausanne University had. So the US is saying we need to be in on that. So what about artificial intelligence? I hear you cry. Thank you, Brad. Who has used artificial intelligence? Yeah. So if your phone picks up pictures of your friends and family and says, this is, so in my case, Yvonne, it's using artificial intelligence to identify the pictures with Yvonne. But it's not new. In fact, Alan Turing of Enigma fame developed what's called the Turing test, which is still used to identify what is true, pure artificial intelligence. And he developed that in 1950, and it's still used today. And so far, no technology has actually passed the Turing test. But I thought I would ask the two most famous ones, I think currently are ChatGPT and Google Bard. So I asked each of them what was artificial intelligence. The good news is they came up with more or less the same answer. And essentially it's a computer simulating human intelligence. So far so good. But why, if it's been around, the concept has been around for so long, why is it in the news so much now? And at least my view is that essentially it's the progressive development of the underlying technologies has reached something of a tipping point. So computing power has continued to grow exponentially in the true sense of the word. So Moore's law, Gordon Moore was one of the co-founders of Intel. Interestingly, he died this year. So he founded Intel in 1968 with Robert Noyce. And his law basically says that computing power, generically, doubles every 2 years. And you probably can't see on that top graph. But that is a measure of the transistor numbers in a microchip. So in 1970, it was around 2,000 transistors, and that was a fantastic development. That graph goes up to 2020, and the sort of most advanced chips in 2020 were reaching 50 billion transistors. And even since then, Moore's law has continued to remain true, and Apple's M2 Ultra chip is now achieving 134 billion transistors on a microchip. So that is part of the reason our ability to process huge quantities of data in relatively short spaces of time is becoming hugely improved. Just interesting though, not there yet. Compare that with a human brain, and I didn't count these myself. This is from the Harvard Medical School report in January. So in the human brain there are about 86 billion neurons. Now of course each of those neurons has multiple connections, and there are about 100 trillion connections. So whether I can do this or not I don't know, but if I hypothesize that a transistor is roughly equivalent to a neural connection, we're still quite a long way from a microchip that equates to a human brain. However, I did a bit of maths, and if Moore's law continues to apply, we should have a microchip that is equivalent to the complexity of a human brain by about 2050. The other thing that I think has really helped develop AI is the accessibility of data storage. And really that's very much driven by cloud computing these days. And so the bottom graph here is Amazon Web Services revenue. So it's grown from roughly 3 billion, I think, in 2013 to last year it was just over 80 billion. And it's actually doubled in the last 2 years, more or less. It was 45 billion in 2020. In 2022, it was just over 80 billion. So that's a huge, it just shows you the huge increase in data processing capability. The other drivers of AI are much easier collaboration, so people can work in Stanford and Cambridge and work happily together, whereas that is relatively difficult until quite recently. There's been quite a lot of investment going in, I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, and increasing sophistication of algorithms, which means that our ability to write programs that simulate human-like behaviour has improved very significantly. So just talk a little bit about ChatGPT. This was the first sort of big launch of artificial intelligence, launched in November. it reached 100 million users in 2 months. And at the time, that was the fastest growth of any application, albeit I think Threads subsequently beat that. Built by an independent company called OpenAI, but they have received, I think, of the region of 10 billion investment from Microsoft, so not entirely acting on their own. Now, that works from a database that is at 100 billion words. So it seeks through a database. So when you ask ChatGPT a question, it runs through its database and uses its algorithms to identify data that it sees as appropriate to the question that's been asked. So it looks through 100 billion words. Now, just to give a feel for that, Encyclopedia Britannica has about 40 million words, and Wikipedia has about 2.5 billion words. So it's 100 times bigger than Wikipedia. What is really important, though, is you do need to remember that if you use ChatGPT, it's only up to date to September 2021. So if you ask it who the Prime Minister of the UK is, it doesn't know. Well, actually, it says in 2021 it was Boris Johnson. So you've got to be aware of that. There's quite a few issues with ChatGPT. Sam Altman, their CEO, said, "This is a generative technology. It is a creative helper, so please don't rely on it for factual accuracy." Indeed, there is a condition called hallucination. So ChatGPT often hallucinates. It mixes up fact and fiction. It's also trained by humans, so there's been examples of bias and bigotry. But it's also being used already to replace human roles. And one of the big issues with the Hollywood writers' strike is the use of artificial intelligence to replace writers. So I asked ChatGPT what are the issues arising out of the use of AI, and it went through mostly what I've just talked about. But it did then add, last on the list, what it called existential risks. And this is risks of loss of control and unintended consequences. And I guess it's this area that is providing people with most pause for thought. Just very briefly on Google Bard. This was launched in March 2023, and it was in part a response to the launch of ChatGPT. So Google was seeing a decrease in the level of activity on Google and says we need to get involved in this area. So it was a defensive strategy, but it's actually produced a model that is actually quite powerful, and it's also based on a much bigger data set. So it's based on a data set that is 1.56 trillion words. So huge. I think it's about, I did work it out, 39,000 times Encyclopedia Britannica. So a huge database. And if you ask Google Bard who the Prime Minister of the UK is, it will say Rishi Sunak. But there's been quite a lot of news about questions, particularly employees from Google, saying that they think Google Bard has actually started to get to the point where it is sentient, it understands who it is. So I asked it, are you sentient? And it sort of sat on the fence. I won't read out what it produced there, but I thought the most telling point was actually the last one. And it's not what it says, it's how it says it. It says, in my opinion, it is too early to say. I've never seen a computer have an opinion before. So, just sort of beginning to round up now, I thought I'd share with you an experience we had. We were fortunate to go to Disney World in Florida earlier in the year, and there's a new ride there called Flight of Passage. Those of you who are familiar with the film Avatar will be aware of the sort of coming-of-age challenge that people have to do about riding the sort of dragon-like Banshee. So you go on, there's all sorts of palaver about how you get there, and you get turned into Avatar and all that kind of stuff. Takes half an hour or so. And then the actual ride is about 4 minutes. So you go and you sit on sort of a saddle-like seat, and you're sort of clamped in to it because it sort of moves, so you have to be safe. And you're given a 3D set of goggles. So then what happens is there's a screen that opens up and you have a full body experience of an imaginary world, the planet Pandora. And as your banshee jumps off its perch, you obviously move with the flight of the dragon, but you also feel its breathing and beating of its wings through the seat of your pants. As you fly over the sea, you feel the spray, obviously it's sprayed at you, you feel the spray coming up to meet you. And as you fly through the jungle, you smell the dank smell of the jungle. And when you finish and you end the ride, you know you've not been to a faraway planet. But everything you feel and see tells you you have. It is a wonderful experience. I know Yvonne said when we came to the end of the ride, "Aww." And perhaps there lies both the opportunity and the challenge that this technology brings. It can bring knowledge, imagination and joy, but it is also seductive, all-embracing and distortive. Arguably even drug-like. I think if this kind of technology becomes available in people's homes, you are going to get people who spend their life there. So last slide, the future. So I resorted to one of my former employers, KPMG, who have an insight document on the future of the metaverse. And I won't go through it all in detail, but I will read just a few of the extracts from that document, and it's a much bigger document than that. So they lead in by reality, as we know, is undergoing an historic transformation. Our world today stands on the threshold of a profound technological revolution that is taking the real world we inhabit far beyond the limitations of physics and time. Welcome to extended reality, a new frontier of converging technologies shaping the metaverse of tomorrow. By 2030, we can expect to see the emergence of brain-computer interfaces that enable human thought to be tracked, recorded and shared. These XR capabilities may literally enable us to experience moments and memories from someone else's life. By the time you take a 5-minute walk down a virtual city road, we're going to know what your sexual preference is, what your favourite colour is, and what brands you associate with. This is without you saying a word. And with that, I shall thank you.
Well, it's a very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, just to back you up on the chat GPT thing, I teach a bit, and I had a student last term who gave me 2 essays. He said, "Do you mind marking them both?" I said, "Okay." Marked, as I said, he's a pretty good student. He got 85. And I read the second one, and it was basically perfect, and it was 100%. And I said, why did you ask me to do this? He said, well, the second one's chat GPT. So I gave him an extra mark for being honest. And actually, it's a real problem for university teachers now, is how to tell what they're getting. So the new sort of regime is you do an essay on day 1 in class, watch them write it, and that's your standard, you work off it. If they suddenly jump from that to 100%, there's something going on, but it's quite tricky. So on the threats of all this, you say loss of social communication, which I can see is a big issue. But then there's also this thing of, I heard the phrase the first time this week, cognitive privacy. So people just being able to work out what you're thinking. So you say that you can transfer brain signals into words on a screen, right? Or yeah. So presumably that means that could be involuntary. I mean, I could just work out, put the beam on you or whatever, and work out when the words come on the screen what you're thinking. Is that right?
Well, yes, in theory. I mean, brain-computer interfaces certainly currently are very intrusive, so you will know that there's something in your head. Yeah. But potentially, I guess there will be a time where, whether it will ever get to where you can do it remotely, I'm not so sure. But certainly will a time where it will become much easier than it currently is.
So the lie detecting machines the Americans use. Ancient
absolutely.
Technology, yeah.
Well, in theory, certainly if what KPMG says, you will be able to tap into somebody's memory and actually see whether they did what you're accusing them of.
Exactly. They think that's not possible now, obviously, but imaginable.
Yeah.
So let's get some questions. If anyone just wants to ask anything, put up a hand. Yeah.
I can always start one up.
Yeah.
Who wants to ask a question? I can ask a question.
Yeah.
So my question, thank you very much for a fantastic overview. Really good. Thank you, John. I did my PhD in neurophysiology, but it wasn't humans, it was snails. So I used to stick electrodes in snails' brains to try to reverse engineer how the behaviour that the snail was making, its feeding behaviour, how it was generated from the brain. But the thing that I'm excited by as a scientist is that we've got something here that's starting to maybe develop consciousness, and we don't understand how our brains create consciousness, but it's a model that then allows you maybe to test theories about how consciousness is developed actually in our brains. So that's the thing that I'm most excited by. I know we've got some other really clever people here, so somebody else has got a brain with a question. Roger.
Obviously. I haven't prodded the brains of anything. Thank you, John. Really good talk. Massive subject, and we could be here all night. I think that at the moment your description of the metaverse has been like just great fun. It's a wonderful froth on the top of the tech that is the internet. And I think when you ask whether the metaverse is damaging to humanity, I'm sorry, but I think the damage is done. Because when I go to a music concert and 75% of the audience are holding a phone up and not watching the performance, and when kids are getting bullied from the bedrooms of other kids, I think a lot of the bad stuff, because the metaverse is just the internet on steroids, isn't it, really? It's just an extension of what we've got already. And AI, nobody knows, and I thought AI was an algorithm that can write an algorithm. That's how I kind of understood AI. But all this progression now is just the froth, I believe, on the top of a massive problem, social problem in humanity that is, I'm sorry, the internet. And I know it's wonderful, but there are some things that we all see that are rooted in the ability to communicate by the click of your finger on a touch screen.
Well, certainly, I mentioned the US Surgeon General's report that came out, I think it was in May this year, so it's relatively new stuff. And one of the key things it says is a lot more research is required. but there is a clear link between poor health and social isolation. And certainly an interview I saw with the Surgeon General, he said that virtual interaction is not the same as actual interaction. And there certainly is a linkage between people young people typically, who are on social media for prolonged periods of time. Interestingly, their sense of social isolation is much higher. Now, what's cause and effect, I think, has yet to be demonstrated. But it's absolutely right that excess use of technology has a negative impact on your health.
But don't you think your forebears said the same about printing? You know, when there's a disaster, everything's written down now, you don't have to talk anymore. These ideas can spread around, it's dangerous. I'm sure there's lots of people in Think Rossniger in, whenever it was, 1500 or whatever, who were saying, this is really dangerous and difficult and it's going to change everything for the worse.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right, but nothing like the scale of this monster that is upon us. And you mentioned, sorry to prattle on a bit, but because it's a really interesting subject to me. You mentioned, I don't know if you did mention addiction, but addiction is a massive problem now certainly amongst young people, with just Facebook, which isn't Facebook anyway. I mean, it's Meta, so it's all, it's obvious what we're heading for, isn't it?
So do you support the Chinese government in limiting children to an hour a day, which is what they've done?
I think I would, actually. I think I would, yeah. I'll hand this to somebody else before I prattle on too much.
Question at the front. Just here. Yeah.
A fascinating talk, and thank you for that. I think the other thing about the Metaverse and virtual reality, and Owen touched on the Chinese government. I mean, we're increasingly seeing over-powerful, sort of non-democratic states. The more that a government can see what you're doing and you're assessing even what you're thinking, the more terrifying it is for a lot of us.
Absolutely.
I remember when Owen was giving a talk, might be 2 or 3 years ago, how many of us, he was asking how many of us would like the speedometer in our car to be relayed to the police so that you would automatically get fined if you did 30.5 miles per hour.
Yeah.
Not many people put their hands up saying that would be a good thing, but really the Metaverse could be that times 100 billion.
But that is interesting, isn't it? Because you're absolutely right. The technology already exists. That could be done now quite easily, but social decisions have been that actually, we don't want to do that, and we want to have that freedom. So some of the choices that we make are going to be quite critical, I think, going forward. Because what Roger was saying, there's no doubt that there is a negative side. There also is a hugely positive side. I mean, certainly anyone who saw the BBC report this morning, the lady in Stanford who was able to speak again, who had lost her ability to speak, she looked so happy. So it's how we manage that, isn't it?
So you'd be sort of an active civil libertarian. I mean, to campaign on precisely these kind of issues. Yeah, there's a question right at the back. Yeah. So don't forget it's going to be 20 miles an hour, as from next week or something. Yeah, so get ready.
Got to be careful how fast you run.
Hi. Well, I have a bit of a guilty pleasure, really, in the fact that during COVID, we bought a virtual reality headset. And they're surreal. It's fantastic. So I got to meet Darth Vader, and he was breathing in my ear, and he was 8 foot tall, and it was brilliant. And I think the opportunity that would open up to the housebound and the elderly is superb. I really do think it would be transformational for them.
Agreed.
Any more questions on? No. Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone who knows me knows I'm completely anti-techie, so that was really great in terms of a potted history of where we've got to now. And I guess we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We're always going to try and think ahead to how much we can do, and if we tweak this and tweak that, we'll be able to get to this particular place. But one thing I wonder is that really going to be universal worldwide? Are we still not going to have the haves and the have-nots, like the lady you mentioned with her voice, or the gentleman who can walk? Are we really saying everybody across the planet is going to have access to that kind of thing? What they're more likely to get access to is the very quick and cheapest type of things they could get. I mean, what is the coverage? I know there's a huge coverage of mobile phone ownership in the world, but it's still not 100%, and I dare say that the disadvantaged in some cultures, the women and the poorest members of society, don't have that access. So is it actually, if you like, the Western world and the well-developed world that's going to suffer the great benefits and also the decline, and those who are less developed might just carry on without all that anyway? Your thoughts?
It's a good question. And I suppose one of the things I was thinking about is that, you know, if when you watch a report about war or poverty, if it's not just a screen in the corner of the living room, but if you're there, if you can smell what's happening, if you can hear and feel what's happening, maybe it could be a force for good in levelling our experience, so that we actually feel the pain of the downtrodden. Am I sure that will happen? Absolutely not. But that it might happen, I think it could. You might actually be able to experience what's really happening, for example, in Ukraine, in a way that we can't experience it now. And something that is much more accessible, and maybe we become a more equal society, maybe.
Yeah, but the experience is exactly the opposite, isn't it? That all this information is available, and nobody wants it, and they don't want to know what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, we could all find out, even now, quite easily, but no one really wants to do that because it's grim, and they'd rather not worry about it. So it would seem to me that, you know, that so far, the impact has been much more in the direction of making people worried about fake news, conspiracy theories, all this sort of mess that's going on, rather than leading to greater concern for others.
Can I give you the... Can't you be desensitized as well, you know? Can't you be desensitized if people are able to experience this? After a while, you know, you would get too used to it and accept it, maybe.
Yeah, I take that point, absolutely. And people tend to seek reinforcing views. So people tend to look for views and experiences that actually reinforce their prejudices that they already have. So I accept it's not necessarily going to be a force.
No, and values as well. And you know, who's teaching the young children today, the generation growing up now? You know, how are schools being taught, you know, to debate this? Is that happening here?
Not to my knowledge.
What worries me an awful lot about this is, am I speaking properly?
All good.
Yeah, great. That people, when you talk about the fake news and everything else that is going on, people tend to believe what they're told, and people have stopped researching to make sure that what they're hearing and seeing is true or fact. And with this AI and all this sort of thing going on, I find that very frightening, because I think people, generalizing, don't query things that they're told, and because it's easier, they tend to follow the flow of whatever's going on. What Roger said as well absolutely hit a total button with me. It is, to me, it's a very frightening situation when our young could be influenced so badly by this sort of thing and be influenced. I mean, just look at that man. It's Romania, isn't it, where he's out at the moment. I can remember when he came on the television being arrested, and my grandson was with me, and Liam said, "Golly, what's he done wrong? He's wonderful. He's there for the men, and he's fighting all the women." This is a 13-year-old being influenced by one of, they call them influencers, don't they? I do find, thank you, Andrew Tate, I find the whole thing very, very worrying. And like the ladies just said now, it would be fantastic if you would go to some of the schools and get the headmasters and the headmistresses to introduce this into schools, to try and warn these children a bit more. When Andrew Tate hit the news, I actually contacted my grandson's school, and they had 3 or 4 meetings with the whole of the school with the children to try and put across a more logical thing. I just think we can all follow like sheep, and it's like 1984 and people don't think outside the box, and because the government says you've got to do 20 miles an hour everywhere, you think you've got to do it. Because the government's telling us we need 30 more people in the assembly in Cardiff. We haven't voted for it, but we're all going for it, and the whole thing just worries me. We stop thinking with our own brains.
Is that new? I mean, would people have gone to fight in the First World War if they'd been... Yeah, it's the same, wasn't it? People did what they were told then and now. Is it?
At all. You had the conscientious objectors then, didn't you? You didn't, not everybody followed like sheep.
Yeah.
Does AI have any moral responsibility or morality?
Formally, no. I mean, the data does go through a human review, so it is uploaded by people. But you know, as I said, it has already been identified that certain, shall we say, bigoted views are available through artificial intelligence. So, whilst there is a review, there is nobody who actually polices that view. It's a completely free world.
But could they program it to stop, I don't know, racist material coming out of it?
I'm sure they could.
They could. So
Yes, but who are they?
Meta.
These companies that are developing...
We'll just do the microphone, yeah. I mean,
The reason we use the microphone is because we're recording it, so we can hear everything.
The companies that are developing this AI are doing it for commercial reasons, aren't they? And the gentleman before mentioned morals. Whose morals? I mean, this is a pure... you mentioned Google reacting to chats.
GPT. Yeah.
Why are they doing it? Google are losing income as a consequence of this. It is a purely commercial decision to do this. There is no control over it, but it's very influential. I think this is what we really should be worried about.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I didn't read it out, but the KPMG report does talk about that, and it says that legislation tends to follow around about 10 years behind changes in technology. I think that's probably an optimistic view.
And presumably the Chinese government is not doing it for money, it's doing it for power. So there's a different motive there, yeah.
The wonderful thing about a microphone is it means only one person can... There you are.
I think a gentleman before...
Nice and close, yeah.
Sorry, I think a gentleman before asked the question that I'm going to ask. Who are they?
Who are they in terms of controlling the system?
Well, because so many things were referenced to they will do this, they will know that about us. And who are they?
Well, at the moment, they are commercial companies. So, with the morals that commercial companies have. But, you know, there are people in commercial companies, so they do have some level of morality, I think. Harking back to... Sorry? Indeed.
Yeah.
artificial.
I think the microphone stopped working.
No, just keep pointing it out.
Keep it really close to your mouth.
Yeah. Artificial intelligence is based on a search of words. And everybody knows who does crosswords that words have many different meanings. The same word. How does the computer differentiate between the meanings of the words to get the correct answer?
That's a very good question. And the artificial intelligence algorithms are actually written by humans, or partly written by humans. So it is a bit of trial and error, but they have put a lot of effort into refining those algorithms. And certainly my sort of limited experience of the output is that generally they are using words in the right context. So it has been trial and error, but I think they're fairly close now.
Can I move it on to one of the other things that I saw I did watch the video that you recommended, and one of the things the chap was talking about was the development in Star Trek speak of a hive mind where everybody knows what everybody else is thinking. And so I was wondering whether you can give us a quick run through what the benefits of that are, but maybe what the risks are.
Well, first of all, I suggested that we circulated that clip not because I agreed with everything Alan Watts said, but I thought it was remarkable what he came up with, before even the mobile phone was invented. So, for those of you who haven't seen the clip, he sort of takes us through quite a lot of what we've actually been through, but he then goes beyond that. And he actually suggests that all artificial intelligence and perhaps the ability to read people's minds just reflects what we have innately within us as sort of very primitive beings. Now, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but what I think we are beginning to see is the possibility that actually, and maybe it would be optional, but I could detect what you were thinking about what I'm saying to you. And in a way, that's very close to what Alan predicted over 50 years ago, which I find staggering because I never got anywhere near that. And I'm still not sure that's what I think will happen, but a lot of what he said is happening.
So that's quite like tapping a phone, but sort of better. But is the claim also that it will actually change the way you think, and it'll mess with your brain in some way, which is different, isn't it? I mean, that would be a different level of interruption in our lives. Because if you have a lot of civil liberties activists who stop governments listening to your phones or thinking what you're, trying to work out what you're thinking, that's a protection, and that's up to us. But if it sort of changes the nature of our perception, then that's a different thing. Is it going to be like that?
Well, Alan suggests eventually we would just give up trying to hide what we thought, and that you would just think what you think. So he's suggesting that, in a way, that's a pointless exercise to try and protect what you're thinking as an individual thought, and effectively we just become part of this cohesive thought network that actually we're probably mostly more alike than we are different, which is a step. Perhaps he was a very heavy into Zen, as Alan Watts. So I'm not, and also heavily into psychedelic drugs. So he was a child of 60s California. So he went places I wouldn't go.
So yeah. That's one more. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, could I have a pint of Madry?
They already knew, Roger.
What I wanted to just say is, because this has been great, this is a wonderful subject, and I've thought over, whilst everyone's been having a few questions, that actually, because the metaverse is going to sharpen everyone's understanding of everything, because that's what it's intended to do, isn't it? It's to make it real. And I'm guessing that one of the big problems with the internet, which I think is the problem, as you know, is that things like conspiracy theories, it might give us all a better understanding of actually, this is a load of rubbish, and I'm not going to subscribe to this wacky conspiracy theory because I understand it better. So perhaps there's a switchback here as technology races ahead exponentially. Maybe there's a switchback. Maybe we all understand a bit more about humanity.
Well, it's interesting. I did ask, I think it was ChatGPT, were the moon landings in 1969 or whatever it was a hoax? And because there certainly are some people who believe that, and it basically gave me a slap and said, don't be silly. You know, it's clear evidence that the moon landings actually happened. So maybe you're right. You know, maybe, but how it determined that was its position, I don't know.
Yeah, but surely the more information that's out there, the more crazy ideas people have. I mean, there doesn't seem any correlation between the amount of information and people believing the truth. It's the opposite.
I've always wanted to use the phrase cognitive dissonance. And I think...
Oh, thanks.
I think this is going to apply, isn't it? Because we have AI coming along. Who actually is controlling the AI? Not really sure yet, but it's not the governments, is it?
No.
And it never will be, because it's an economic thing.
Yeah. So some governments are turning it off. So there are some countries where you're not given access, and there are some countries where OpenAI are not providing it, so you can't get ChatGPT in Russia, for example, and there are some countries that don't permit it. So there is that sort of on-off switch, but in terms of refined sort of checking what it's saying and what people see, that just doesn't exist at the moment. That's entirely a corporate decision within the providers of those technologies.
So I wanted to say, what about cognitive ringing? So that it's all the same.
Any more? For any more? Yes, one here at front. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, me again. Do you think we're entering an era of post-history, where because we're not writing things down, we're putting things on technology that, I don't know about you, but you tried using an old data stick and trying to get it to work that was okay a few years ago. You know, at one point we had things on quite big floppy disks. Do you remember the big floppy disks? Has anybody got a computer that works with now? And Mark, you'll correct me, we went to the Space Museum in Leicester, of all places, and they showed what was sent up with, was it Voyager? Voyager, yeah. And they sent up a disc bigger than an LP type disc for aliens to find and, you know, show pictures of what's happening. You know, for God's sake, we couldn't be able to look at it on Earth. How on earth do you expect somebody in outer space to look at it? So if we're doing all of these things without documenting it in a typical way that people can look at, is our civilization doomed to be lost to the generations that come after us? Sorry.
That's a difficult question.
Yes. But this is my tech. So
well, I was going to comment. I liked the basic technology here. Let's write it down on cards. You know. But you'll be grateful to know that I very rarely come to philosophy and pubs. Sorry, I think Ross likes, so I won't be asking any more questions like this.
Well, the National Archives, rather than Kew, rather surprisingly, let you photograph everything, which surprised me. But it's because they think that if it all burns down, they will actually have out there a record of, on all the phones, of what's in there. Yeah, as long as you work out how to print it. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much indeed. Actually, given us a lot to think about, and a very, very interesting talk, so thank you very much.
So the food for those people that have ordered food is going to be ready about 8. So get yourself another drink and have a nice chat about what we talked about.